Did you know that the very nation opposing Israel today was prophesied thousands of years ago? How does ancient Persia, now Iran, fit into God's eternal plan for his people? Join us as we uncover the truth behind this powerful prophecy and what it means for Israel and us. In this video, we will explore the incredible role that the Persian Empire, now modern Iran, plays in biblical prophecy. From the rise of Persia to God's plan for Israel's future, we'll dive into ancient prophecies and how they unfold in the world today. We'll take a deep dive into key biblical prophecies, the rise of Persia, the role of Cyrus the Great, the story of Esther, and how Iran's modern actions align with God's plan. Stay with us as we see how these ancient truths are still shaping our world today. 1. The rise of Persia, from small tribe to empire. In the ancient world, the Persian Empire began as a small region east of Mesopotamia, barely known to the larger powers of the day. Surrounded by the mighty Babylonian Empire to the west, Persia seemed insignificant. The Babylonians were rulers of the ancient world, their power unchallenged, their gods exalted. King Nebuchadnezzar II ruled with iron strength, and the people of Israel found themselves in exile, their temple in ruins, their faith seemingly in tatters. Yet above the earthly empires and their rulers, God was sovereign, and he had already written the future. In Isaiah 45:1, God makes a remarkable declaration. This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of to subdue nations before him. This was a prophecy about Cyrus the Great, the king of Persia, though at the time he was still an unknown figure. Isaiah's prophecy not only foretold the rise of the Persian Empire, but also singled out Cyrus by name, decades before he was even born. This powerful act of prophecy shows us that God's plan is never limited by time or human understanding. Cyrus, though a pagan, was raised by God to fulfill a specific purpose, to overthrow Babylon, liberate the Jewish people, and allow them to return to their homeland to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. The Persian Empire, once a collection of scattered tribes, began to grow in influence and power, slowly uniting under the leadership of King Cyrus. His military genius and God's providence turned Persia into one of the largest empires of the ancient world. While the mighty Babylonian Empire celebrated its gods and viewed itself as invincible, Persia was quietly growing stronger in the east. God was preparing Persia to change the course of history. Isaiah's prophecy revealed that Persia's rise was not accidental, but part of a divine plan to fulfill his promise to Israel. The Jews who were living in captivity in Babylon did not know it, but the very empire that had exiled them was about to fall, and a new power would rise to set them free. God's sovereignty is evident in the way Persia's rise was foretold. Nothing happens by chance in God's world. Persia's rise was not just a political or military maneuver, it was God's plan unfolding. And just as God chose Cyrus to fulfill this mission, he continues to choose leaders and nations to fulfill his purposes today. Even when the world looks chaotic and unpredictable, God is working behind the scenes to bring about his plan, just as he worked through Persia to accomplish his will for Israel. For us, this teaches an important lesson. God's plan for our lives is not limited by our circumstances. Just as he used a small, seemingly insignificant nation to fulfill his purposes, he can use any situation or any person for his glory. No matter how small or powerless we may feel in the grand scheme of things, God has a plan for us, just as he had a plan for Persia. In our own lives, we may not always understand why certain events happen or why we're in particular situations. But the story of Persia's rise reminds us that just as God had a plan for them, he has a plan for us. Whether we see it or not, God is working in our lives, shaping our circumstances for his purpose. This is a call to trust in God's sovereignty and know that his plan for us is greater than we can imagine. 2. The prophecy of the ram, Persia's military power. In Daniel 8:3-4, the prophet Daniel describes a vision. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but the longer one came up last. This vision was not just a strange dream. It was a divine message about the rise of Persia. The ram represents the Medo-Persian Empire, with the two horns symbolizing the two kingdoms, the Medes and the Persians. The longer horn represents the Persian Empire, which would eventually dominate and lead the world through its military prowess. This vision, given to Daniel long before the rise of Persia, is a striking example of how God reveals future events through his prophets. At the time of this prophecy, the Medo-Persian Empire was not yet an established power, and the Persian kingdom was just beginning to rise. Yet God already knew that Persia would become a mighty force, overthrowing Babylon and expanding across the ancient world. Daniel's vision made it clear. Persia was destined for greatness, and their military power would be unstoppable. The ram's charge in all directions, westward, northward, and southward, signifies Persia's conquests. The Persian Empire expanded rapidly, taking control of vast territories, including Babylon, which was the heart of the ancient world. Persia's military strength was not just the result of human strategy, it was God's plan unfolding perfectly. The ram's unstoppable power serves as a reminder that while earthly empires may seem strong, it is ultimately God who directs the course of history. The Persian military success was not simply due to the brilliance of its kings, but because it was part of God's divine will to bring about the restoration of Israel. For Christians today, this vision holds profound spiritual significance. It shows us that God is in control of human history, even when it seems like the forces of evil are winning. Persia's rise was part of God's larger plan to bring Israel out of exile and restore the Jewish people to their homeland. Similarly, we can trust that God is orchestrating events in our lives, even when we don't understand the full picture. Like Persia, we may face challenges or situations that seem beyond our control, but God is always at work behind the scenes, guiding us to fulfill his purpose. Furthermore, the vision of the ram points to the truth that God uses unexpected nations and people to fulfill his will. The Persians, who were not followers of Israel's God, became the instruments of Israel's freedom. God is not limited by the world's standards of power or influence. He can use anyone and anything to bring about his plan. This should give us hope, knowing that God can use us, no matter how small or insignificant we may feel, to accomplish his will. The ram's aggression toward Babylon and other empires also reminds us of the spiritual battle that exists behind every earthly conflict. While Persia's military victories were physical, they were part of a larger spiritual struggle. This battle between good and evil continues today, and we must remember that, just as God directed the rise of Persia, he is actively involved in our lives, guiding us through the spiritual battles we face. In our own journey, we may find ourselves caught in battles that feel overwhelming, but like the ram, which could not be stopped, we can trust that God's power is with us. He is the ultimate source of strength, and his plan will prevail. The vision of the ram serves as a powerful reminder of God's sovereignty over history and the spiritual victories he promises to his people. 3. Cyrus the Great, God's instrument for deliverance. In Isaiah 45:13, God declares, "I will raise up Cyrus in my righteousness. I will make all his ways straight. He will rebuild my city and set my exiles free." This prophecy, made over a century before Cyrus the Great was born, is a striking reminder of God's control over history. Although Cyrus was a pagan king, God chose him to fulfill a divine purpose: the liberation of the Jewish people from Babylonian captivity. God's hand was upon him, and this declaration is one of the most significant instances in which a non-Israelite ruler was called anointed by God, showing the extent of God's sovereignty over all nations, not just Israel. Cyrus's rise to power was not random, it was divinely orchestrated. The Babylonian Empire, which had taken the Jewish people into exile, seemed invincible. Yet, in a single night, as foretold by the prophet Daniel, Babylon fell without a fight. The Persians, led by Cyrus, conquered Babylon swiftly, fulfilling the prophecy that Israel's deliverance would come through Persia. But Cyrus's role did not stop there. he issued a decree that allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. This act of liberation was not just political but deeply spiritual. It marked the fulfillment of God's promise to restore his people and his temple. Cyrus's actions show us that God is not limited to using only those who know him. Despite being a pagan king, Cyrus fulfilled God's plan because God used him as his instrument. This serves as a powerful lesson for us. God's sovereignty is not confined to religious leaders or believers. He can use anyone, regardless of their faith, to accomplish his will. This truth reminds us that God's purposes will always come to fruition, regardless of the circumstances or the people he chooses to carry out his work. We may never fully understand why God uses certain people or events, but we can trust that his plan is always perfect. The story of Cyrus the Great also teaches us the importance of God's timing. God had promised Israel's return from exile, and he raised up the right king at the appointed time to make it happen. In our own lives, we may not always see the timing of God's plans. We might feel like we are waiting in a season of exile, waiting for God's deliverance. But just as God worked through Cyrus at the right time, he will also act in our lives when the time is right. We are called to trust in God's timing, knowing that he will fulfill his promises to us. Moreover, Cyrus's decree is a reminder of God's grace and mercy. God could have freed his people in any number of ways, but he chose to use a foreign king. Not for any merit of Israel's own, but because of his faithfulness to his promises. This shows us that our deliverance is not based on our own efforts or worthiness, but on God's grace. Just as God used Cyrus to free the Israelites, he uses his grace to deliver us from our own struggles and burdens. The impact of Cyrus's actions ripples throughout history, and his role in God's plan should serve as a model for how we view God's sovereignty. We may face rulers, leaders, or situations that seem outside of our control, but God is always working behind the scenes. Even the most unlikely sources can be part of his plan, just as Persia, under Cyrus, was used to fulfill God's promise to Israel. In our lives, we should remember that no matter who or what God chooses to use, his will always prevail. Like Cyrus, we can be instruments of God's plan, even if we don't fully understand how he's using us. This should encourage us to trust that God is working in and through all things for his glory and our good. 4. Haman's plot, spiritual battle behind the scenes. In Esther 3:6, we read about Haman's deep resentment toward Mordecai, a Jew who refused to bow to him. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. This moment marks the beginning of a plot that would threaten the very existence of the Jewish people. Haman, a high-ranking official in the Persian Empire, was not simply acting out of personal offense. His anger was rooted in a long-standing spiritual battle that stretched back centuries. Haman's actions were a reflection of the ancient animosity between the Israelites and their enemies, particularly the Amalekites, from whom Haman was descended. The Amalekites had been one of Israel's first and most relentless enemies, as seen in Exodus 17:14-16, where God declared war on Amalek for attacking his people. This spiritual conflict was not just about political power, but about the preservation of God's promises to Israel. Haman's plot to annihilate the Jews was another attempt by the forces of evil to thwart God's plan for his chosen people, a theme that runs throughout Scripture. God's intervention in the story of Esther is a powerful reminder of his protection over his people. The plot, which seemed destined for success, was turned on its head by a courageous and faithful woman, Queen Esther. Despite the danger she faced, Esther approached King Xerxes, risking her life to expose Haman's evil scheme. Esther's bravery and faithfulness in the face of certain peril became the key to turning the tide. God used her position in the palace to save her people, demonstrating that he works through ordinary individuals to accomplish extraordinary things. The story of Esther is deeply spiritual. It highlights the reality that behind every political or social event, there is often a deeper, spiritual struggle. Haman's plot was not just a political maneuver, it was an attack on God's plan of redemption through Israel. This spiritual battle is reflected in the broader biblical narrative, where the forces of evil consistently attempt to destroy the lineage through which the Messiah would come. Every attempt to wipe out Israel was ultimately thwarted because God was working behind the scenes to protect his covenant and fulfill his promises. For Christians today, the story of Esther encourages us to act with faith and courage, especially when we find ourselves in situations where the odds seem stacked against us. Like Esther, we may be placed in positions of influence and opportunity, not by our own design, but by God's plan. It calls us to take bold steps when the Lord calls us, even when the cost seems too high. Esther's story teaches us that even when we can't see God's hand directly, he is orchestrating events for his glory and our good. Just as God protected the Jewish people in the story of Esther, he promises to be with us in our own battles, no matter how daunting they seem. Haman's demise in the very gallows he prepared for Mordecai is a striking demonstration of God's justice. The evil that was intended for God's people turned back upon those who sought to destroy them. It's a reminder that no matter how powerful the forces of evil may seem, they cannot prevail against God's will. In the end, those who oppose God's plan will be judged, and his people will be protected. This spiritual battle behind Haman's plot reminds us that the forces of evil are at work today as well. But just as God intervened in the days of Esther, he continues to work in the lives of his people, turning what was meant for harm into something good. In times of struggle, we can trust that God is fighting for us, just as he fought for Israel in the days of Esther. 5. The modern role of Iran, fulfillment of prophecy. In Ezekiel 38:5, God prophesies, Persia, Cush, and Put will be with them, all with shields and helmets. This prophecy is strikingly relevant to our times as it points to Persia, modern-day Iran, being part of a coalition that will one day rise against Israel. While ancient Persia was instrumental in the liberation of the Jewish people, in the latter days, this same region would align with other nations in an effort to destroy Israel. This alignment is a clear reminder that biblical prophecies are not only about ancient history but also about current events and future outcomes. Iran, once part of the mighty Persian Empire, now plays a central role in the Middle East, and its hostility toward Israel has been a topic of great concern for decades. Iranian leaders have repeatedly declared their desire to see Israel wiped off the map, which echoes the ancient spiritual battle that has been fought for centuries. Just as Haman sought to destroy the Jews in Esther's time, Iran's stance today represents the modern manifestation of this ongoing spiritual conflict. While Iran's actions are rooted in political and military strategies, there is a deeper spiritual element at play. The forces that oppose Israel are not simply human but spiritual, as seen in the Bible's many prophecies about nations rising against God's people. The spirit of hatred and violence that seeks to undermine Israel's existence is part of a much larger battle between good and evil. Iran's opposition to Israel is not just about political control, it is about challenging God's chosen people, and by extension, challenging God's sovereignty. The prophecy in Ezekiel 38 paints a vivid picture of a time when many nations will come together to attack Israel, but the outcome will be God's divine intervention. It is not by human might that Israel will be saved, but by God's power. This is a powerful reminder that despite all the earthly powers that may rise against Israel, God's protection is unshakable. As we see Iran's continued hostility toward Israel today, it serves as a stark reminder that God is in control, and his ultimate plan will prevail. For Christians, this connection between ancient prophecy and modern events should serve as both a warning and an encouragement. The Bible is clear that Israel plays a central role in God's eternal plan. As believers, we are called to stand with Israel, recognizing that God's promises to his people have not changed. Supporting Israel is not merely a political stance, it is aligning ourselves with God's will. As God declared to Abraham, "I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse." Genesis 12:3. This promise still holds true today, and our actions toward Israel matter in the grand scope of God's prophetic plan. In addition, the modern role of Iran in this prophecy should remind us that the battles we face in life are not always visible. Just as Persia's rise and its role in end-time prophecy were written long before the events unfolded, we too must recognize that God is at work in the unseen world. The forces of evil may appear strong and unrelenting, but just as God intervened in ancient times to protect Israel, He is still actively at work in our world today, guiding the course of history and fulfilling His promises. Iran's opposition to Israel is part of a larger spiritual narrative, and it is a call to Christians to stay vigilant and steadfast in their faith. Just as God has promised to protect Israel, He has promised to protect His people. The spiritual battle continues, but the victory belongs to God. In these turbulent times, we can trust that, just as God was faithful to Israel in the past, He will be faithful to His people in the future. 6. The spiritual battle behind the prophecies of Israel. In Ezekiel 38:14-16, God speaks about a time when Gog and his allies, including Persia, modern-day Iran, will come against Israel. This prophecy speaks to a future invasion of Israel, one that is fueled by nations' hatred of the Jewish people. But behind this physical battle lies a much deeper spiritual battle. The forces that oppose Israel are not merely human. They represent the age-old conflict between good and evil, between God's will and the powers that seek to thwart it. Throughout history, there has been a relentless effort to destroy Israel. From Pharaoh's pursuit of the Israelites in the Exodus to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans, the Jewish people have faced numerous attempts to wipe them out. Yet, time and again, Israel has survived, and God has been their protector. The modern threat posed by Iran and its allies is no different. It may appear to be a political or military conflict, but at its core, it is a spiritual battle against God's plan for His people. In the book of Revelation, the Apostle John describes the final battle between good and evil, which will take place in the valley of Armageddon. Revelation 16:16 says, "Then they gathered the kings together to the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon." This final confrontation will see the forces of darkness aligned against the forces of light, with Israel at the heart of it all. The opposition that Israel faces today is a precursor to this ultimate battle, where the nations that oppose Israel will be defeated by God's divine intervention. For Christians, this spiritual battle reminds us that our struggles are not only physical or material, but deeply spiritual. Ephesians 6:12 says, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." Just as the nations of the earth have been used by spiritual forces to oppose Israel, so too are we called to recognize that our own battles are not merely against the visible challenges we face, but against the unseen forces that seek to undermine God's will. The spiritual battle behind the opposition to Israel is also a reminder of the power of prayer. Throughout the Bible, we see how prayer and intercession play a vital role in God's plan. In the story of Esther, it was the prayers and fasting of the Jewish people that led to the downfall of Haman's evil plot. Likewise, our prayers can play a crucial role in God's purposes today. We are called to intercede for Israel, praying for its peace, safety, and protection. Just as God heard the cries of the Israelites in ancient times, He hears our prayers today. Furthermore, this spiritual battle calls us to take a stand in our own lives. If we believe that we are engaged in a spiritual battle, we must be equipped with the armor of God. Ephesians 6:13-17 describes this armor, which includes the belt of truth, the breastplate of righteousness, and the shield of faith. As we face our own personal battles, whether with temptation, discouragement, or fear, we must remember that we are not alone. Just as God protected Israel in the past, He will protect us as we stand firm in our faith. In conclusion, the opposition Israel faces is not just a political or military issue. It is part of a larger spiritual war that has been raging for centuries. The forces of evil continue to seek to destroy Israel, but God's sovereignty will always prevail. For Christians, this calls us to engage in the battle of faith, recognizing that our prayers, our trust in God, and our obedience to His will are part of His divine plan. Just as God intervened in the past to protect His people, He will continue to fight for us in the future, and the ultimate victory belongs to Him. Conclusion: God's sovereignty and our hope. As we reflect on the prophetic role of Iran, once Persia, in biblical history and its current stance toward Israel, we are reminded of the unshakable sovereignty of God. From the ancient rise of Persia to the modern-day threats against Israel, one truth remains: God's plans are unfolding with perfect precision. Just as He raised up Cyrus to fulfill His purpose and protected Israel through Esther's courage, so too will He intervene when the nations rise against His people in the final days. The spiritual battle we see in the world today, reflected in the opposition Israel faces, is not just political. It is deeply spiritual. It is a struggle between the forces of evil that seek to destroy God's chosen people and the overwhelming power of God's protection and sovereignty. The prophecies about Israel and the nations surrounding it remind us that God is in control of history and is working behind the scenes even when we cannot see it. For Christians today, this prophetic truth calls us to trust in God's perfect plan. As we face challenges in our own lives, we can take comfort in knowing that, just as God protected Israel in the past, He will protect us as well. We are part of God's unfolding story, and our trust in His promises is the key to overcoming the spiritual battles we face. In these turbulent times, let us remember the victory that is assured to God's people. No matter the forces of opposition, no matter the political or spiritual struggles we face, we know that God is always at work, and His victory is certain. Let us continue to pray, stand firm in our faith, and trust that the ultimate triumph belongs to God.